Hi everybody, welcome to Painting for Pleasure. I thought it'd be a good idea, as we talked in the past, to do something in teaching how to mix colors. Many of you ask me what color I use, and what I generally do is I've always said that you can use pretty much most any color to paint anything. But there's a fundamental process to mixing colors that we need to work out and that you have to understand. So what I've done is I've taken my watercolor paper and I drew a triangle up in this area right here. And I'm actually taking this from a book. I mean, there's many ways. Every book that we have, in the first, the first 60 pages of a 100, 200 page book usually defines mixing colors, how to use a brush, what kind of materials that you need to use, and so forth. But a lot of you have asked me about this, how to create neutral colors, how to take and mix the colors that I want to create the mood and the environment and the light and the vibrancy and so forth. So what I'm going to do is do a couple of things to go through this process. And this is going to be a class literally in the exercise of mixing colors. I'm not going to do a painting per se. We're not going to do anything other than just to give you an idea as to how to handle some of this stuff. So what I want to do is I wanted to draw this out. And also what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take you through the process of what you need to do to take the water out of your brush and utilize a damp brush, a wet brush, a dry brush, damp pigment, wet pigment, dry pigment, and the same thing with paper. Now this is the standard paper that I usually use pretty much. It's 140 pound, 100% rag, fibered handmade paper. This paper, like a lot of papers, when you start to use paper, I'm going to suggest to you that you use the same paper over and over again, because if you switch papers, it's a new learning curve. In other words, paint will not take, the paper will not take paint the same way if it's a different kind of paper. Every paper has a unique characteristic to it, and it'll take the paint differently. So it's important that you understand that. It's important that you understand how to handle some of this stuff. So let's start with the paper. I'm using, this is 100% rag content, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush. Now here's my palette, and what we're going to use right now is we're going to use alizarin crimson. I'm going to use French ultramarine blue, and I'm going to use New Gamboge. So my primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. Now I know that I don't happen to, we'll do this with cobalt blue as well, and we'll probably do it with cerulean blue, so that it's going to create a different kind of blue, different kind of set of circumstances, and a different kind of mix. But these three basic colors are fine for now. French ultramarine blue does have a little bit of red in it, so it's a little bit on the violet side of blue. But for the most part, we should be able to handle this okay. So let's just take a brush. And I'm going to do this by dipping my brush in the water. Now let's see if I can, before I go through that process, let's just do this. I'm going to take and wet my brush. I just wet my brush. It's thoroughly saturated. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to run a wet line all the way up the side here. I'm going to run a wet line down to this area here, and I'm going to run a wet line across here. Okay, so we're going to thoroughly saturate the area along this line. Nice and wet. Everything else we're going to remain dry, but we're going to do it nice and wet. All right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to pick up some French ultramarine blue, And I'm going to put a daub of that French ultramarine blue right here. And I'm going to end up doing the same thing with alizarin crimson. Down here. And I'm going to put the same thing with my New Gamboge. All right? All pigment in the four corners. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to run this over this way. All right? To the end of the line, I guess. And take this and run it this way. All right? And come down here with my yellow, and I'm going to move it up to this area here. And I'm going to do the same thing with my blue coming down this way. And I'm going to do the same thing with this. I'm going to take the blue and run it down this way, and my red up. And I want you to just sit and watch it. I got to put a little bit more in here so that I have, this daub is not enough, but I'm going to make a little bit more daub of pigment there. A little bit more daub of blue up here so that you can see this, because I want you to understand what's happening. All right? French ultramarine blue. Okay. If we allow that to just wick, that is to say, if we allow the paint that I just put in there to run its course, to do whatever it wants, this, in other words, this is going to sort of move up to this way here. This will move over to that way there. The red is going to move this way and up this way, and the blue is going to move down this way. What's going to end up happening is that there's going to be a natural transition that's going to take place, because this blue and this yellow are going to end up making green. This yellow and alizarin crimson end up running in here. It's going to end up being an orangish color, and the red and the blue is going to make a purplish color over here. That's really all you really need to worry about, or no? There's a natural process where these two colors make a third color, somewhere in here. There's a natural process where this color and this color ends up making a third color along here. And the same thing with over here. So when I say let's mix some colors, generally speaking, I'm mixing wet into wet, as I did right now. Now we can do it another way. Let me just do this. Let's do another triangle. And I wet it first that time around, but let's just do another triangle here. Let me just see if I can draw this in. I don't want to hit that, so let me hold it up. So here's my triangle. Okay, so we've got a triangle. All right, so now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to leave this dry, and I'm going to take and put a daub of my pigment here. That's my French ultramarine. I mean, that's my New Gamboge, my yellow. I'm going to put a daub of alizarin crimson over here. And I'm going to put a daub of my French ultramarine below there. Now, this is dry, not wet. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to take a damp brush. So I'll wet my brush, take the water. This is a wet brush now because I thoroughly put it into the water. Take my brush and remove it so that it's damp, it's not wet, saturated. And now I'm going to move my brush down this way, and I'm going to move this up this way. Okay, wet the brush, come back, take the water out of the brush so it's damp, and again go up this way. Take the water out of your brush, come down this way. Okay, do the same thing this way. Come across this way. Wet, take the water out of your brush, damp brush, and move it across into here. Okay? Two ways to do it. Wet first, allow it to just go wherever it wants to go. On a dry piece of paper, you're actually manipulating the paint from into these two areas. Essentially, what you're doing is you're creating the same effect. One on dry paper, one on wet paper. When it dries, ultimately what's going to end up happening, you're going to end up having the same transition. So when you're dealing with wet into wet, literally you can't manipulate it. It goes wherever it wants to go. It's still drying, as a matter of fact, as you can see. On this situation here, you're actually physically coming in here and pulling the pigment from here up or out, however the case may be, right? You're wetting the paper, wetting the brush rather. You're taking the water out of the brush. Now again, this is a very important bit. You need a damp brush. You don't want a wet brush, because if you have a wet brush, you're going to end up getting puddles. So into the water. Remove the water from the brush by gently taking the hairs of the brush and allowing it to hit your sponge. This is nothing more than a sponge. I know it's a tissue, but it's your sponge. Right? You can use a sponge as well to do this. Doesn't make any difference. But the fact of the matter is that's what you're doing. And with a damp brush, you're coming in here and manipulating the paint. Okay, so blue, yellow makes a blue, yellow, green. You can see it. Red and blue is going to make a more of a violetish color in here. And this red and this yellow is going to make more of an orange color in here. These are the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. If I use a different pigment, for instance, if instead of using French ultramarine blue, what's going to happen if I use cerulean blue? Well, I'm still going to get cerulean blue, and New Gamboge still going to make a green, but it's going to make a different kind of a green, because both of those, the yellow and the cerulean blue, which is a lot lighter, doesn't have any red in it, it's a lot cooler in color, is going to end up changing my green in here. If I use opera, or if I use Pyro Red instead of French ultramarine, instead of alizarin crimson, I'm going to get a different set of type of purple in here. Now here's the interesting part. Every color that's in here that you're seeing is fresh. It's fresh, it's vibrant, it has illumination to it, it has energy to it. None of the colors that you're seeing along that triangle are what I would consider neutrals, or in the parlance of another language, muddy. They're not muddy. They can't be muddy, because you're using red and blue, red and yellow, yellow and red. They're not going to be muddy. What's going to happen is that if we come in here and we take and we literally bring the blue down into here, the red into here, and the yellow into here, and I'm going to try to do that for you. We'll just daub that in there. Big daub of yellow. We'll come up here and daub the blue a little bit. And we'll come in here and daub the red a little bit, right? Okay. And then we draw those in, and I'm going to do this with, right? So I'm going to bring my blue down to here, to the center, my red over here to the center, my yellow into here to the center. And what's going to end up happening is the combination of these red and yellow and blue collectively together. So we'll just daub it here. I'll just show you what's happening. We'll put that in there. Put a dab of yellow in there. Dab of red in there. And now what you have in here is pretty much, and it's very wet right now, so it's going to be hard to see, but I'm going to make a big circle here so that you can see it. I'll do it down here again. That's wet. I'm going to do it dry by just coming in here and taking my blue and putting it in here. Take my yellow and put it in here. And take my red, alizarin crimson, and put it in here. And it's those three colors. The only way you can get a neutral is to mix those three colors together. And this becomes more of a neutral. Now, it's not, you're not seeing that as much, but that's what's going to end up happening. You can't create a neutral unless you're using all three colors. We're going to have to let those dry a little bit so that you can see that. But mixing colors is extremely important when you're painting, because it's easier than buying, oh, I don't know, 96 different colors. And I'm going to do something here. I'm going to take that and dry that out. Dry that out. So this will become more, if we look at this, we start to play around with this stuff and you're putting color in here. This is where people get muddy. Okay? Is to bring these three colors in. It's the only way you can do it. The only way you can create a neutral. My French ultramarine blue. My alizarin crimson. All those three together. That's what's going to end up happening. Now, depending on the amount of pigment that you use, you are going to get a different feel or luminosity to the paint. For instance, all of this stuff in here is loose and watery. Everything that's in here, it's light. There's no hard, heavy pigment. So therefore, you're going to get it lighter. That's your, your white is your white of the paper in watercolor. And when you put this down here, as long as you keep this light, you don't use a lot of pigment, you're going to end up with a nice, airy, light feel. As soon as you start to put a lot of pigment in, it's going to darken up. Right? So I have a lot of pigment. See what I just did here? So there's a lot of pigment in here and here and here. There's a lot of pigment out there. It gets dark. But as you fade this out with water on either side, it lightens up. Water is your lightener. Your whitener, if you will. If I were doing, for instance, horizon, I'm just going to wet this a little bit. I'm wetting it with a little bit of my just colored water, just a wet watered area. All right, using the water that I had for my red paint mixture. All right, okay, so this is it. So that's wet. So if I take and I put wet into wet, now this is totally wet, right? Like I said, the paper is thoroughly saturated. It's got a little tone in it so that you can see, but I'm thoroughly saturating it. Now let's go down here. This is it. I'm going to make this Wet it down here, but I'm going to dry it out a little bit more. So thoroughly saturated to very little water, right? So thoroughly saturating it. When you put pigment into a thoroughly saturated area, so let's do this. I'm taking a wet brush now. Wet brush, wet pigment, wet paint, wet paper. See what happens? Wet brush, wet pigment, wet paper. No ability to control it, none whatsoever. It's going to go wherever it wants to go. Wet brush, wet pigment, wet paper. How do we know it's thoroughly wet? Well, this has a glisten or a gleam on the paper itself. It's all saturated, nice and wet. Now, one of the things that it will do when you do this is you should notice that I just put a basic stroke across here. What happened with that pigment when I put it down is it slowly wicked down. It dispersed. It softened. It lightened. Because as the paint comes down and wicks away, it becomes lighter and lighter and drier and drier. So you're going to see a stronger value up in the top here where I put more pigment and much less. It's slowly making a transition. You can see it slowly making a transition. So if I want to make a natural transition from a darker color to a lighter color into a wet area, the way to handle that is a lot of pigment into a damp brush, not a wet brush. I mean, that's wet, right? A lot of pigment now into a damp brush, and I'm going to put it into a wet surface right here, right? A lot of pigment. Now look, it's going to wick out, it's going to soften, but because the brush was damp and I had a lot of pigment on my brush, you notice how very intense it is in here? Now it's wicking out as well. There's a gradation process, a natural gradation process going up the paper and down the paper. But what's happening? It's slowly wicking out, it's going to lighten, but with a lot of pigment, it's going to maintain a richer, darker, more meatier, more energetic tone in here. Darker, and it's going to stay pretty much in that area. Okay, this one was wet paper, wet brush, wet pigment, no control. This one was a wet paper, a damp brush with a lot of pigment, much more control. You notice that whatever I put down here is pretty much staying right in that area. It's wicking out, yes it is, but not as much as this. And it'll maintain that shape and maintain that brilliance, that dark value. If I were to take dry paper, okay, and I'll do it up here, dry paper, a damp brush, and a lot of pigment, look what happens. Look what happens. Dry paper, a lot of pigment, damp brush, pretty much stays right where I put it. Dry paper, this is a dry brush effect. Dry paper, damp brush, okay? If I were to take my dry paper or damp paper, which this is right now, let's call this damp paper, a damp brush, and a lot of pigment, and I went in to put this over here. I'm doing a line of on top of that. That's going to stay pretty much where I put it. Okay? So I have the ability to manipulate this shape, as you can see, and maintain that shape that I just manipulated in that area where it's got some moisture to it, it's damp, and that's pretty much going to stay where it's at. So this is a damp paper, damp brush, a lot of pigment into a damp surface, and again, you can do that. Okay, so let's go down here and do the same thing. Let's go in here and take a, I'm going to wet my brush. I wet it so, take my water out of the brush, pick up my pigment, okay, and I'm going to come in here into, I'm going to go from here, which is dry, into the wet area, so you can see what's going to end up happening. See? Now, what happened is that on a dry side, that's a lot stronger. As it hit the water, I'm maintaining my shape pretty much, but it's dispersing a little bit, and as soon as it hit the water, it lightened up. So if you want the darkest pigment, if you want to maintain pigment that is dark, you need to have a damp brush, dry or damp paper, and a lot of pigment with very little water in there. See what happens? Look. But here's the interesting part. This is all hard-edged. This area here where it was a little bit damp ends up being the edge, notice how the edge softened? In here and here, it's not as hard as it is out here. It softens, and in here where it was a little wetter, it even softened more. If you go back up here where I put this in, I still maintained all of this pigment, still in the same place. If you see what happened right here, all the heavy pigment is still right over here. So learning how to apply paint to a dry surface, let me rephrase, let me start again. Learning how to apply dry paint to a dry surface with a dry brush, and let me rephrase that too. It's never, when I say dry brush, a brush is never dry to the point where it has no water in it. It's simply that what we've done is we've gone in, we've wet the brush, thoroughly saturated the brush, so that there's a lot of water in it, and we've taken the water out of the brush, picked up our pigment, and applied the pigment to the paper. Now I got a dry brush on dry paper with dry paint, okay? If I were to do this into an area that's wet, and I'll wet this right here, right? Let's saturate that section right there. And I let it dry enough so that the glisten is off the paper, which we're going to do. Let it dry. That's thoroughly saturated and wet. So we want that wetness to get into the fiber of the paper. So we don't want to, we want to see the glisten of the gleam come off. Once it loses its glisten, That means that the water has saturated the paper enough to start drying it out. So it goes from wet to damp. And until it goes from wet to damp, I'm going to help this around. Let me just bring this out a little bit. Just want to watch that. We want to set the paper up so that when we apply our next layer of pigment, I'm going to apply a wet pigment up in this area, and I'm going to apply the drier pigment down here. All right, so you can see what's happening. The water now, all this area is drying a little bit more. This is still glistening down here. So I'm going to take water, wet brush, remove some of the water. I'm going to pick up my pigment. All right, I got pigment on the end of the brush, and I'm going to move it from my dry area into my wet area and out again. You're going to see what's going to end up happening there. That shape will be pretty much, that because the paper is damp, that shape is going to stay pretty much where I put it. It's going to soften, yes, but it's going to stay pretty much where I put it. And if I want to, I can add more pigment in here so we can ensure that it stays there. Okay? However, if I take a wet brush, wet pigment, and put it in here, it's sort of going to go wherever it wants. I'm not going to be able to control it. Wet brush, wet pigment into a damp area, and it's just going to sort of go, I won't be able to control that shape. However, I got a wet brush and wet pigment on a dry area, and I create a different effect. Wet brush, wet pigment on a dry area. It's going to stay there because I'm painting it on a dry area. But I'm going to have hard edges. Notice the hard edges? If I take water and I add water to certain areas, let's just do this. Add a little bit of water in there. I'm adding wet water to a damp area. And we're going to see what happens. Wet water to a damp area. Wet water to a damp area. And let's just see what happens here. Wet water, wet pigment. The pigment is consistent with watery, fluidy pigment or milky pigment. But you can see what ends up happening is that the water in a damp area now is penetrating and creating little tiny blooms or blossoms. Notice what's happening here? Little tiny blooms or blossoms. It's happening right here. If I took wet water, watery area, and wet pigment, that's not going to happen with wet into wet. I won't get the blossoms that I will here because it's wet water into a wet area. It's wet pigment, wet brush into a wet area. This is a damp surface where I added water to it, and I'm creating these little blossoms down here. Don't know why I didn't do it. This one should have done it in that one too. So, learning brush control, learning application of paint to a surface is critical when you are painting. Whether you're painting wet into wet, or you're painting regularly like a glazed piece where you're building it up, it doesn't make any difference. If you end up with blossoms, what you're doing is you're putting water into a damp area. The only thing that I could possibly do here, if I wanted to glaze this, I want to make one transparent color over another, in other words, is to let it dry thoroughly. Okay, so let's take this here. This area right here should be thoroughly dry now. And we're just going to take a color. We'll take, you know, I'm mixing just this color and I'm going to put it right on top of it. Okay, that you can do, and it'll hold. You'll be able to see the color come through because the color underneath is thoroughly dry. The color underneath is thoroughly dry. If it's thoroughly dry, this again is thoroughly dry. Let's do this. Let's take a darker, we'll use the red. Right? And I'm taking this now, and I'm not wetting the paper. I have a wet brush and wet pigment, and I'm just going over this. I've actually done two things here. I've applied my wet pigment onto a dry surface with a wet brush, and this is the original color right here that I applied. That's the original color that I applied, but over the surface I'm seeing through the transparent top color that I just put down to the dried bottom color, and I'm going to create a third color or different value as well. Notice what happened here as this dries. This is the color that I put down, and it was a very watery mixture of cerulean blue and my red. But I can see through all of this stuff. This goes wherever it wants to go. This created blossoms. This pretty much stayed where I put it. Right? Dry into wet. You can see what happens. Soft edges as it comes in here. Very hard edges out there. Is it possible for me to soften those edges out? I don't know. Let's take my water. Start here, and I'm working myself into my hard edge. Yes, it's possible. I can soften that edge by taking the water from my brush, wet water, watery pigment, right? And we're pretending that this is clear water because I don't have any clear water, but we're pretending. And I'm working myself from the dry area out here into from the dry paper, I'm working it into where my dry brush is. Let's screw it up here. Maybe you can see this over here a little bit better. So we'll start up here with wet water. All right. We're going to come down and go into that area. And when you do that, what you're doing is you're allowing the water to work itself into the pigment, soften the pigment, and that pigment will wick down a bit. If I want to lighten that up, I can do that with tissue. But because this isn't wet, it's dry, what's going to happen is that I'm going to continue to get a hard edge around here unless I actually go in here with clear water and soften that up. Okay, I'm using clear water. I can't use tonal water. Got to use clear water to soften that up. Okay, thoroughly wet. And we can sort of soften this up to the point where we can wash that out. So these are brush applications with different consistencies of pigment on the paper create certain types of effects. This is critical, and you should be, what you really should do, guys, is to play around with this kind of stuff. Use varying colors, mixture of colors, and so forth to do this. Because it's the only way that you're going to learn to do it. But notice that this is soft in here. I was able to remove the hard edge by allowing my water to wick in to the dried area. All right, you see up here I did it? See that hard edge? Same thing that's going to happen there. That hard edge is going to stay hard unless I soften it up with clear water. Not tonal water, but clear water. That'll soften up. You see this? This is drying. I got a third color in here where I glazed over it. And if I thoroughly let it dry again, heck, I can do the same thing. Thoroughly let it dry and put my glaze on top of that. I'm going to have this color and this color make a third color. And depending on how you do this, you will get variations of tonal value that will help you to glaze a painting. That's glazing, but can only be done when it's dry. What we're going to do is we just set up a bowl of water here, and I got my color palette around here. And I need to get, here, let's just get this. We'll use this as a sponge. All right. So, one of the things is this. You're going to have a water, sponge, and a brush, okay? So, there's no reason why you can't use a sponge like this, right here. The thing is that a sponge like this cannot be dry to take the moisture out. It has to be wet. Sponges are not effective unless they're damp. They're wet. So what I would have to do with this thoroughly dry sponge is come in here and soak it first and let and remove all the water so that the sponge has an ability to absorb the water. Sponge won't absorb the water unless it's damp. Can't absorb the water when it's dry. That's a sponge. This is a sponge. The same thing would happen here. I would go do the same thing with this sponge. It doesn't make any difference which sponge you use. This is a sponge, people. This is paper towel, but it's a sponge as well. All right. Now this happens to be Viva paper towel, which is a nice soft sponge to it. No pattern on the texture. No texture on this at all. And it makes for a beautiful sponge. It's nice. It works to pick up stuff off the paper. It works to take stuff out of the brush. But let me show you the process. The process is more important than anything else. So, I have right now a brush here, and that brush I want to thoroughly soak with water. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm thoroughly soaking it. You see how soaked that is? Now you remove the water. Here, thoroughly soak it. Remove the water from the hairs of the brush so that the brush is no longer saturated, but what it is it's damp. It's not going to liquidly drop water. Like if I left that up here, that's so, look, that's, see what happens? The water comes off that. That's thoroughly soaking. Well, you want to remove the water. Okay? That's what you have to learn to do. Soak it, remove the water with a damp brush. Now you have a damp brush. Okay, so let's pick up some pigment. Now we've been hey, I'll come in here and I'll use my blue. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to pick up my French ultramarine blue. Okay. And that's pretty much pigment consistency with a little bit of water in there on my brush. The brush is damp. If I apply it, I'm going to apply it to an area. I gotta get another brush to wet this with, so hang on for a second. Let me wet my surface first of all. Okay, so I'm applying the pigment that I picked up from the well where I had my French ultramarine blue, and I've got a wet area over here. I've dipped it in here. Remember, I took the water out of the brush by putting it on the sponge, picked it up, and then I'm putting it in to a wet area, right? Putting it into a wet area. Notice what I'm doing. I'm crossing over. Every time I make that stroke, I'm crossing a little bit over the stroke I just left. 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 So you're saying, some of you say, well, how do I get a consistent color? You need pigment, water, sponge, wet area, and always overlap the stroke you just put down. That will eliminate or lessen the amount of streaks that you have as you apply paint to the paper, into the wet area. So, let's wash out the brush again. Right? Wet brush. Now I have a wet brush while I'm doing this. I have a wet area where there's pigment already in it, but just water in this brush. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go over the area. Just with clear water, overlapping, overlapping, overlapping. All right. Water. Just overlapping. Right? Overlapping. Okay. What happens when this dries is that what I've done is I've overlapped a little bit up in this dark area right here. As that dries, that should wick down a bit, lighten up, and lighten up even more as it comes down. Now, if I want to actually turn this to white, I used water in my brush. I need to get clearer water. So what I'm going to do is spray this with clear water. And we're just going to let it set. This should remain nice and vibrant and dark. There should be some transition that's going to go on in here, and this will go off to white. The key to this is wet the brush, thoroughly saturate the brush, take the water out of the brush before you go in and you pick up the pigment. Now, if the pigment is totally dry, now my pigment has got some water in it and wet, but if, for instance, you're dealing with picking up totally dry pigment, okay, I'm going to put this on dry paper. I went in and I wet the brush. I took the water out of the brush, picked up dry pigment. I'm going to put it on dry paper, not wet paper this time. Okay. Overlapping it as I go down. You notice what I'm doing? It's maintaining pretty much the solid area. That's because Well, let me just keep going here for a second until I exhaust this. It gets drier and drier. Okay, now look. I went in, I picked up, thoroughly wet the brush, come in and took the water out of the brush, went in and got pigment. Now, when I say dry pigment, it's got moisture in it, but it's not watery. It's got a lot of pigment consistency to it. It's thicker. When I applied this, I just kept going over and over and over. That's because, and then it took my paint all the way down to this point here before I started to lose it. That's because watercolor brushes are designed to hold water within the ferrule of the brush, okay, within the hairs of the brush. So even though it's damp on the outside, there's still water in the inside that's leaching through the hairs of the brush to help this process along. So if I want to soften those edges, I can now take my tissue, which is a sponge, I can wet the tissue. One way to do it, wet the tissue, come in and soften some of this stuff up a little bit. Wet the brush and do what I told you before. Come in from the side and let it penetrate from the outside to the inside to try to soften this up so that you get a better transition. But that water has got to eat at that dry pigment in order to do that. It's got to get in there and break it up, break those molecules up so that it softens it up a bit. Okay? And you want to try to stay away from scrubbing it as much as possible. But notice the consistency of paint. Pretty much here and within here, as this dries, you'll see what's happening. It's drying, it's still wet, but it's drying lighter in the edges. It'll be darker some in here. So if you're looking for an application where the application is stronger pigment-wise, you're going to take and do it this way. You're going to take a wet brush, take the pigment out of your brush, pick up the pigment, take the water out of your brush, pick up the pigment, and start to make the application on a dry piece of paper so you get more of a solid color. This way you're going to get some variation in it. Now if I want, at this point, I can go back and I can add water to this and help it down, help it along. All right. This is still so one of the ways to do this, make this transition from light to dark, is to do just what I just did there. If you want, you can run up, you can take water and run it up. Okay, and you can add pigment at the bottom. And you can add pigment at the top and allow them to blend together. Let's move this out. You can dab it to lift. You can soften the edges. You can make a glaze over it. There's so much you can do with pigment and paint. The pigment, the paint, the paper, the brush, it all depends on how you're using this. Okay, so we got some nice bright stuff on this side, but let's say that we want to really make some neutrals. We want to do grays and warm grays and cool grays and so forth. As I said to you before, we can do this with primary colors. So what our primary colors are going to be red. We're going to use the same thing. We'll use French ultramarine blue. We'll use, tell you what we'll do. We'll use cadmium red or pyro red instead of alizarin crimson. And I'll use, we'll use the new gamboge as well. So all we're going to do is change one red, okay? So let's do this. Let's take alizarin crimson. I'm sorry, let's take French ultramarine blue. That's what I meant. All right, let's take French ultramarine blue. Let's just put it down here. I'll take a French ultramarine blue. And we're going to work in a small amount of pyro red into that. See what's happened? It goes, right? What's happening is it's gone from blue to red, made of purple. We're getting close to that neutral color that we want, but we also need to add a little bit of yellow to this. See what's happened? We're mixing it, and we're getting what? See the dark? It's gone from blue to blue purple to purple yellow into this wonderful neutral, which is a gray. Using these three colors. Percentage-wise, maybe 60% or so French ultramarine blue, maybe 30% or so, or 20% or so my red, maybe 10%, 15%, and a little bit, maybe 20% or so of my yellow. But the mixture, nonetheless, as we mix it, causes me to get gray. Depending on whether or not you use more blue or red, red-yellow will give this gray more of a warmer gray or a cooler gray. So that has to be understood. Blue with a little bit of red, again maybe 10%, and maybe adding 20% or so of yellow, 30%, whatever. But what happens is that when you start to mix all of this stuff, look what happens. You get this nice gray. So let's take my French ultramarine blue, which I often do. You've seen it before. Let me put it in here. And I say take French ultramarine blue and take burnt sienna, all right, and mix them together. Burnt sienna, French ultramarine blue, and we're going to get a gray, but it's going to be gray brown. Watch. See that? It's going to be a warmer gray. Not as cool, because I'm using a red brown as I do this. So the gray that you get, the neutral that you get, is a good strong neutral, and it's not muddy. It's not a muddy neutral. You're going to get mud when you mix all three colors together if you don't mix them properly, but you can control that by how this is mixed. The degrees by which you add a certain amount of blue. Let's use yellow ochre. All right, let's use yellow ochre, and we'll mix yellow ochre together with that blue. What happens? And then maybe we'll add a little bit of red to it. We can't do, all right, let's go here. Add a little bit of red. All right, so we're gonna get a variation of the three. Those three colors together are neutrals. A little bit brighter, a little bit warmer, a little bit grayer over here. It varies. You can control the neutrals and you can continue to mix neutrals. Say you take cobalt blue. Yeah. And yellow ochre. All right, cobalt blue and yellow ochre. What happens? Well, yellow ochre has a little bit of, it's yellow. It's got a little bit of red in it. So, you know, you're going to end up having interesting neutral go on in here with this cobalt blue. It's going to be a different kind of a neutral, different color. Cerulean blue. These are just experiments, people. Let's get cerulean blue, pyro red, pyro red, right? Look at that nice purple. Add a little bit of yellow, no gamboge. Sorry about that, the telephone rang, I had to shut it off. Anyway, I'm playing around with this, just mixing up those three colors. Again, you got some interesting variations in this for some neutrals that are a little different. But they're fresh neutrals, they're not muddy neutrals. Yes, you can get dirty and you can get muddy. You got to be very careful about it. But if you don't play with this stuff, if you don't mix these, you'll never understand what colors mix with what colors mix favorably to keep you away from getting muddy and still keep your neutrals fresh. This is fun to do. You can have, here, I want to show you this. Here, this is, we'll use this. This is Naples yellow. Okay. Let's take some Naples yellow and then we'll take some opera. And here's what's nice. You use a little bit of opera, a little bit of Naples yellow. Now, you're not going to get, with this, you're going to get, it's not going to be neutral, but what you will get is something that's very interesting in terms of combining these two colors. You're going to get flesh tones of varying degrees. Look. See that? And if you add a little bit of burnt sienna out here, you get a little bit darker flesh tones. So whether or not you're, sorry about that, nice flesh tones. Let these things dry out. Lots of fun stuff that you can have when you're playing around with mixing colors. But take the time to do it. Take the time to go in and mix them and play with them. You can see what's happening over here. This is all dry now. That's dry. You can actually control the textures on these things And you can control the amount of pigment in there and make it, if you keep glazing over it, you can make it darker, you can make it consistent in terms of the color so you see no streaks. It all depends on the application. There's a lot you can play with, a lot you can do. You can use a little bit of sepia in some of this stuff. If I want to darken this up. Okay. How to make nice darks. One color over another. You'll see it. Let that dry, you're going to see it. It's going to get nice and punchy. You're going to get real dark. Alright, a lot of pigment. So if you want a real dark, you lay one color underneath, red or blue, and then put the other dark on top of it. You'll get a nice rich dark. Lots of fun stuff that you can do really with regard to mixing colors. So I think we've covered the mixing of colors, we've covered applying, wetting your brush into the water first, taking the water out of your brush so that the brush is damp, going in and picking up the pigment, and then applying the pigment to the paper, whether the paper is dry, damp, or wet, will give you a different feel or a different texture. Let's see. Well, I think that's it for now. I think what we've done is we've covered the mixing of paints. We've from this, which was our basics and our triangle, to applying different kinds of things. And look what's happened here. Where I put in, and this is very interesting, where I put in water into a damp area, you can see where it wicked in, you can see the blossom. But there's no blossom here, no blossom here, no blossom here, no blossom here. Little blossoms in this. Depending on whether the pigment that you're using is wet or damp, and the paper that was either wet or damp will give you varying degrees of application in terms of the paint and how it's going to work. Okay? So that being said, I think we'll call it a day. Thank you for being with me. I hope you get something out of this. And I appreciate you being with me, and next week we'll paint. Thanks again. I'm Tony Visco. I'm your host. This is Painting for Pleasure. These exercises are designed to help you paint more proficiently. Thanks again for being with me.